The twin moons of Kethera cast an eerie blue light across the battlefield. Sergeant Marcus Chun crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been a Zephyrian transport vessel, its crystalline hull now shattered like broken glass across the rocky terrain. The acrid smell of plasma burns and alien blood filled his nostrils as he checked his rifle's power cell. 73%. Not great, but it would have to do. The Third Galactic War had been raging for 18 months now, and Earth's forces were losing badly. The Hegemony Alliance, a coalition of 12 alien species led by the militaristic Corvani, had superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and a centuries-old grudge against humanity for refusing to submit to their rule. What they hadn't counted on was human stubbornness. Marcus adjusted his tactical helmet and peered through the scope of his plasma rifle. His squad had been tasked with a simple reconnaissance mission: scout the crash site of a Hegemony command vessel that had gone down during yesterday's orbital battle. What they found instead was a massacre. Bodies littered the crash site, mostly Corvani soldiers with their distinctive reptilian features and bronze-colored armor. But there were others too, delicate, almost ethereal beings with translucent skin and flowing robes that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. These were Zephyrians, one of the more peaceful member species of the Hegemony, known throughout the galaxy for their advanced medical knowledge and diplomatic skills. "Sarge, you need to see this," came the voice of Private Rodriguez through Marcus's comm unit. The young soldier was positioned about 50 meters to the east, near what appeared to be the main section of the crashed vessel. Marcus made his way carefully through the debris field, stepping over chunks of twisted metal and avoiding the occasional sparking wire. The Corvani were known for booby-trapping their crash sites, and he had no intention of becoming another casualty in this pointless war. Rodriguez was crouched next to a large piece of hull plating that had been thrown clear of the main wreckage. "Sir, I think this one's still alive," he whispered, pointing to a figure partially hidden beneath the metal debris. Marcus approached cautiously, his rifle ready. What he saw made him pause. It was a Zephyrian, but unlike any he'd encountered before. While most Zephyrians were tall and willowy with pale, almost transparent skin, this one was smaller, more delicate. Her skin had a faint luminescent quality that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, and her long, silver hair was matted with what appeared to be bright blue blood. More striking still were her clothes. While other Zephyrians in the wreckage wore simple robes or military uniforms, this one was dressed in elaborate garments that sparkled with what looked like embedded gems. Even damaged and blood-stained, the outfit screamed of royalty or high rank. "Rodriguez, help me move this debris," Marcus ordered, slinging his rifle across his back. Together, they carefully lifted the metal plating away from the injured alien. She was conscious, her large, violet eyes tracking their movements with a mixture of fear and defiance. When she tried to speak, only a weak, melodious sound emerged from her lips. Nothing Marcus could understand. The translator implants that all human soldiers carried were designed primarily for Corvani and the other major hegemony languages, but Zephyrian had proven difficult to decode due to its complex tonal nature. What Marcus could understand, however, was the extent of her injuries. A large piece of shrapnel had pierced her left side, just below what he assumed were her ribs. Blue blood seeped steadily from the wound, staining the rocks beneath her. Her left arm was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle, and there were numerous cuts and bruises across her pale skin. "She's hurt bad, Sarge," Rodriguez observed unnecessarily. "Should we call for evac?" Marcus considered their options. Officially, they were supposed to avoid contact with enemy personnel unless necessary for mission completion. Unofficially, most human soldiers had developed a grudging respect for the Zephyrians, who were often found serving as medics and field doctors rather than combat troops. Unlike their Corvani allies, Zephyrians had never been known to torture prisoners or commit atrocities against human civilians. But this was clearly no ordinary Zephyrian. Her elaborate clothing, the way she carried herself despite her injuries, and the fact that she'd been aboard what appeared to be a high-priority transport vessel all suggested she was someone important, possibly very important. The alien tried to speak again, this time managing to form what sounded like words. Though Marcus couldn't understand the language, the tone was clear enough. She was trying to warn them about something. "Rodriguez, keep watch," Marcus ordered, kneeling beside the injured Zephyrian. "And see if you can raise Captain Morrison on the comm." He pulled out his field medical kit and began examining the alien's wounds more closely. Human and Zephyrian physiology were different enough that most of his medical training didn't directly apply, but the basics of trauma care were universal. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient, and get them to proper medical care as quickly as possible. The shrapnel wound was the most serious concern. The metal fragment was still embedded in her side, and removing it in the field could cause fatal bleeding. Marcus used compression bandages to secure the area around the wound, being careful not to push the shrapnel deeper. As he worked, the Zephyrian watched him with those intense violet eyes. Despite her obvious pain, there was an intelligence there that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his own daughter back on Earth. The alien couldn't be much older than Sarah, who had just turned 19 before he'd shipped out for this tour of duty. "Sir," Rodriguez called out softly, "I'm getting movement on the eastern ridge. Looks like Corvani patrol, about a click out, and heading this way." Marcus cursed under his breath. A Corvani patrol meant they had maybe 20 minutes before this area would be crawling with enemy soldiers. Not enough time to call for an evac, and certainly not enough time to move the injured alien to safety through the rough terrain. He looked down at the Zephyrian, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She was trying to say something again, pointing weakly toward a particular piece of debris about 10 meters away. Marcus followed her gaze and saw what looked like a small, crystalline device partially buried under some twisted hull plating. "Rodriguez, check out that crystal thing she's pointing at," Marcus ordered, continuing to work on the alien's injuries. The private jogged over to the indicated spot and began carefully excavating the device. "It's some kind of communication array, I think," he reported. "Definitely Zephyrian tech. I can tell by the binaural interfaces." Marcus had heard about Zephyrian biotech before. Unlike human or Corvani technology, which relied primarily on mechanical and electronic components, Zephyrian devices were grown rather than manufactured, incorporating living tissue that could interface directly with their nervous systems. It was part of what made their medical technology so advanced, but it also made their equipment nearly impossible for other species to operate. The alien was becoming more agitated, trying to point at the device while speaking rapidly in her musical language. Marcus was beginning to understand that she wasn't just asking for help. She was trying to tell them something important about that communications array. "Sarge, whatever she's trying to say, we need to make a decision fast," Rodriguez warned, checking his scope again. "That patrol is closing in, and I count at least 8 Corvani soldiers. If they find us here..." Marcus knew what the private meant. Corvani soldiers weren't known for taking prisoners, especially not after finding their own dead. And if they discovered that humans had been in contact with what was obviously an important Zephyrian prisoner, it could lead to retaliation against human civilian populations. But as Marcus looked down at the injured alien, at her delicate features, her obvious youth, and the trust she seemed to be placing in him despite everything, he found himself unable to simply walk away. There was something about her, something that reminded him not just of his daughter, but of every reason he'd joined the military in the first place, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "Rodriguez, how long do you think it would take to get that communication device working?" he asked. The private looked surprised. "Sir, I'm not sure I could get it working at all. This is Zephyrian biotech. It's completely alien to anything we've trained on. But she could operate it, right? If we could stabilize her enough and get her over there." Rodriguez glanced nervously toward the approaching patrol, then back at his sergeant. "Maybe, sir. But even if she could send a message, we'd be broadcasting our position to every hegemony ship in orbit. And we still have that Corvani patrol to deal with." Marcus was quiet for a moment, weighing their options. The smart military decision was obvious. Leave the alien and withdraw before the patrol arrived. Intel suggested that Corvani forces had been executing Zephyrian prisoners lately, accusing them of being security leaks and sympathizers to the human cause. If they left her here, she would almost certainly die. But there was something else to consider. If this alien was as important as her clothing suggested, she might have valuable intelligence about hegemony operations. And if she was trying to use that communication device to contact someone, it might not be to call for help. It might be to pass along critical information. The Zephyrian had gone quiet, but her eyes remained fixed on Marcus's face. Despite the language barrier, there seemed to be an understanding passing between them. She knew he was trying to decide whether to help her, and she was waiting to see what kind of person he really was. Marcus made his decision. Rodriguez, we're going to move her to that communication device, he announced, already beginning to gather his medical supplies. If she can get a message out, maybe it's worth the risk. The private looked skeptical, but didn't argue. How do you want to play this, Sarge? You keep eyes on that patrol. I'll stabilize her for transport, and then we'll carry her over to the device. If she can operate it, great. If not, we grab what intel we can from the crash site and get out of here. Marcus turned back to the alien, who seemed to understand that he'd decided to help her. Her violet eyes closed briefly in what might have been relief, and she spoke a single word in her musical language that somehow managed to convey gratitude despite the language barrier. Working quickly but carefully, Marcus used field splints to immobilize the alien's broken arm and applied additional compression to her other wounds. The shrapnel in her side was still a major concern, but moving her was a calculated risk they'd have to take. All right, let's do this, Marcus said, gently sliding his arms under the alien's shoulders and knees. She was lighter than he'd expected, almost delicate, but he could feel the strength in her frame that suggested Zephyrians were tougher than they appeared. Rodriguez led the way to the communication device, scanning constantly for signs of the approaching patrol. The device itself was about the size of a briefcase, made from what appeared to be living crystal that pulsed with soft, internal light. Bioneural interface, tendrils extended from various points on its surface like delicate vines. Marcus carefully positioned the alien next to the device, supporting her as she reached out with her good hand toward the bioneural interfaces. The moment her fingertips made contact, the entire device came alive with swirling patterns of light and color. The change in the alien was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes took on the same internal glow as the device, and when she spoke now, her voice had a harmonic quality that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. She was clearly communicating with someone or something through the device, but the conversation was entirely in her own language. Sarge, Rodriguez called urgently. Patrol's at 800 meters and closing fast. Whatever she's doing, she needs to do it quick. Marcus watched as the alien's conversation grew more urgent. She kept looking back at him while she spoke, occasionally pointing in his direction. There was something in her tone that suggested she was describing him, possibly even advocating for him. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the alien's conversation reached what sounded like a conclusion. The device's glow faded slightly, though the bioneural interfaces remained active. The alien turned to Marcus and spoke directly to him, her tone serious and formal. Though he couldn't understand her words, Marcus had the distinct impression that she was trying to tell him something important about their conversation. She pointed to herself, then to the device, then to him, repeating a sequence of musical tones that sounded almost like a designation or code. Rodriguez, we need to move. Now, Marcus ordered, hearing the distinct whine of Corvani energy weapons powering up in the distance. But as Marcus prepared to lift the alien again, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Looking directly into his eyes, she spoke a single word in accented but recognizable standard, promise. Marcus stared at her in shock. You speak standard? She nodded weakly, switching to his language with obvious effort. Little, promise you protect. She pointed to the communication device, then back to herself. Important. Very important. I don't understand, Marcus said, even as he could hear Rodriguez calling out range estimates for the approaching patrol. The alien, no, the princess, because that's what she had to be, closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, her voice was clearer, more confident in the human language. I am Lyralii, daughter of the Zephyrian Council Prime. The message. I told them about you. About human honor. They will come. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Who will come? My people, Lyralii said simply. But also yours. This war, it does not have to continue. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the crack of energy weapons echoed across the crash site. Rodriguez was already returning fire, his plasma rifle lighting up the darkness with bursts of coherent energy. Sarge, we got company, Rodriguez shouted over the sound of the firefight. Marcus looked down at the injured princess, understanding that whatever decision he made in the next few seconds would change everything. She was offering him something, a chance at ending the war, maybe, or at least changing its course. But it would mean putting his life and Rodriguez's life on the line for an alien he'd just met. The princess seemed to read his thoughts. I know what I ask, she said quietly. But my people, your people, they die for nothing. This can change. Marcus heard Rodriguez cry out in pain, followed by the distinctive sound of Corvani war cries. Time was running out, and he had to make a choice that would echo far beyond this single battlefield. Looking into Lyralii's violet eyes, Marcus Chun made the second most important decision of his military career. The first had been to join the service to protect others. This one might actually give him the chance to do it on a scale he'd never imagined. Rodriguez, he shouted, hefting his rifle with one hand while supporting the princess with the other. We're fighting our way out, and we're taking her with us. The private's response was immediate and professional, despite the blood streaming from a grazing wound on his temple. Copy that, Sarge. Which direction? Marcus quickly scanned their tactical situation. The Corvani patrol had them partially surrounded, but there was still a gap to the north that led toward the human lines. It would be a fighting retreat across rough terrain while carrying a wounded prisoner, but it was doable. North by northwest, Marcus called back, triggering a burst of covering fire. Stay low and keep moving. We've got a princess to deliver. As they began their desperate retreat across the alien battlefield, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this decision to save one injured alien, was going to change the course of the entire war. He just hoped he would live long enough to see whether that change was for better or for worse. The twin moons of Kethura continued their silent watch as three unlikely figures disappeared into the night, carrying with them the first real hope for peace the galaxy had seen in 18 months of bitter warfare. The journey back to human lines turned into a nightmare of plasma fire and desperate maneuvering through the rocky terrain of Kethura. Marcus carried Princess Lyralii in his arms while Rodriguez provided covering fire, their tactical retreat becoming increasingly desperate as more Corvani patrols converged on their position. Incoming from the east, Rodriguez called out, diving behind a boulder as energy blasts seared the air where he'd been standing. I count 3 more squads closing in. Marcus ducked low, feeling the heat from a near-miss plasma bolt wash over his back. The princess in his arms had lost consciousness somewhere during the first kilometer of their retreat, her breathing shallow but steady. The makeshift bandages he'd applied were holding, but she needed proper medical attention soon. How far to the perimeter? Marcus asked, checking his rifle's power cell. 37%. Not good. Maybe 2 clicks, Rodriguez replied, popping up to take a shot at a pursuing Corvani soldier. But they're herding us away from the main checkpoint. Looks like they want to cut us off from friendly lines. Marcus cursed silently. The Corvani weren't stupid. They'd recognized the tactical situation and were trying to force the humans into the Badlands to the west, where the rough terrain would slow them down even further. Standard pursuit doctrine for dealing with escaping prisoners. But Marcus had an advantage the aliens didn't know about. Before the war, he'd been a wilderness survival instructor for new recruits. He knew how to navigate hostile territory, and, more importantly, he knew how to use that terrain against pursuers who weren't familiar with human tactical thinking. "Rodriguez, I'm changing our route," Marcus announced, adjusting his grip on the princess and starting to move toward what looked like a dead-end canyon. "Follow me and trust me." The private looked skeptical, but followed orders, laying down suppressing fire as they moved toward the canyon mouth. Behind them, the Corvani were closing in, their harsh voices echoing off the rock formations as they coordinated their pursuit. The canyon Marcus had chosen appeared to be a natural trap. High walls on 3 sides with only one way in or out. Any military tactician would have called it suicide to enter such a position while being pursued, which was exactly why Marcus was counting on the Corvani following them in. "Sarge, this is a dead end," Rodriguez protested as they entered the narrow canyon. "Not quite," Marcus replied, spotting what he'd been looking for. About halfway up the western wall of the canyon was a narrow ledge that led to what appeared to be a cave opening. It was barely visible in the moonlight, and the climb would be treacherous, especially while carrying an unconscious alien princess. But it was their best chance. "See that ledge up there?" Marcus pointed with his chin, unable to free his hands while carrying Lyralii. "That's our way out." Rodriguez squinted upward in the dim light. "Sir, that's got to be a 30-foot climb up a near-vertical rock face. And we don't have climbing gear. We don't need gear. We need desperation and good handholds," Marcus replied, already studying the route. "The Corvani will assume we're trapped down here. By the time they figure out we've gone up, we'll be long gone through whatever cave system is behind that opening." The sound of approaching Corvani voices echoed off the canyon walls, growing closer by the minute. Marcus quickly scanned the immediate area and found what he was looking for, a shallow depression in the rock face where they could temporarily hide the princess while he and Rodriguez made the climb. "Help me get her secured," Marcus ordered, gently placing Lyralii in the natural shelter. He used climbing rope from his pack to create a makeshift harness that would allow them to haul her up the cliff face once they reached the ledge. Rodriguez was already studying the rock face, identifying potential handholds. "I can make that climb, Sarge. But what about her? If she wakes up during the ascent?" "She won't," Marcus said with more confidence than he felt. "And if she does, she'll understand what we're doing. She's tougher than she looks." The first Corvani soldiers appeared at the canyon mouth, just as Marcus began his climb. The rock was rough and offered good grip, but the angle was steep and the moonlight made it difficult to see the best route. Below him, Rodriguez waited with his rifle ready, prepared to provide covering fire the moment they were spotted. Marcus climbed with the desperation of a man who knew that capture meant not just his own death, but the loss of what might be the galaxy's best chance for peace. Each handhold brought him closer to the ledge, and each meter gained was another small victory against the odds. Halfway up the cliff face, disaster struck. A piece of loose rock broke free under Marcus's weight, clattering down the canyon wall with enough noise to wake the dead. Below him, he heard Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath, followed by the harsh exclamations of Corvani soldiers who had definitely heard the noise. "Targets located. Canyon wall, halfway up," came the translation from Marcus's comm unit, the battlefield translator finally, managing to parse the alien language. Energy blasts immediately began searing the rock around Marcus as he pressed himself flat against the stone. The heat from near misses made the rock face too hot to touch in places, forcing him to find new handholds while under direct fire. "Rodriguez, return fire," Marcus shouted, continuing his desperate climb, even as plasma bolts burned the air around him. The private opened up with his rifle, the distinctive whine of human plasma weapons echoing off the canyon walls. But Marcus knew it was a losing battle. Rodriguez was outnumbered at least 3-1, and the Corvani had the advantages of cover and superior firepower. With his lungs burning and his arms aching from the climb, Marcus finally reached the ledge. The cave opening was there, just as he'd hoped, but it was smaller than it had appeared from below. He'd have to wriggle through on his belly, which would make getting the princess up even more challenging. Rodriguez, your turn, Marcus called down, already securing the rope for the princess's ascent. But when he looked down, his heart sank. Rodriguez was pinned behind a boulder by heavy fire, and there were now at least a dozen Corvani soldiers in the canyon. Even worse, more aliens were rappelling down from the canyon rim, having found their own route to the high ground. I can't make it up there, Sarge, Rodriguez called back. Too much incoming fire. Marcus made another split-second decision that went against every piece of military training he'd ever received. Instead of abandoning his position to escape through the cave, he opened fire on the Corvani from his elevated position on the ledge. The aliens had been so focused on Rodriguez that they hadn't expected incoming fire from above. Marcus's first burst caught two soldiers completely off guard, dropping them before they could take cover. His second burst forced the others to scatter, giving Rodriguez the opening he needed to begin his own climb. But Marcus's elevated position also made him a target for the Corvani rappelling down from above. Plasma bolts began striking the ledge around him, sending chips of superheated rock flying in all directions. He was exposed, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. That was when Princess Lyralii regained consciousness. Marcus first realized she was awake when he heard her voice, weak but clear, speaking rapidly in her own language. But she wasn't talking to him. She was talking to someone else. Looking down, he saw that she had managed to activate what looked like a personal communication device, some kind of biotech that had been concealed in her elaborate clothing. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every Corvani soldier in the canyon suddenly stopped firing, their weapons lowering as they received what were obviously urgent communications through their own comm systems. Within seconds, the entire firefight had ground to a halt. What the hell? Rodriguez muttered, still pressed against the rock face, but no longer taking fire. Marcus was equally confused until he heard Princess Lyralii speaking in accented standard, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Corvani soldiers, she called out, her tone carrying unmistakable authority despite her weakened condition. This is Princess Lyralii, Star Weaver, diplomatic heir to the Zephyrian Council Prime. You will stand down immediately. The response from the Corvani was immediate and respectful. Marcus's translator picked up fragments of their conversation, acknowledgments of her identity, requests for orders, and what sounded like apologies for the pursuit. Sarge, Rodriguez called up quietly. What the hell is happening down here? Marcus was wondering the same thing. Within minutes, the entire tactical situation had reversed itself. Instead of being hunted fugitives, they were suddenly being treated as the escort for alien royalty. The Corvani soldiers had formed a defensive perimeter around the canyon, and their leader, a massive reptilian figure in ornate armor, was approaching the princess's position with obvious deference. Princess Lyralii spoke rapidly with the Corvani commander in their own language, occasionally gesturing toward Marcus's position on the ledge. Though he couldn't understand the conversation, Marcus got the distinct impression that she was giving orders rather than explanations. After several minutes of discussion, the princess called up to Marcus in standard. "Sergeant Shun, please come down. It is safe now." Marcus hesitated. Everything in his tactical training screamed that this was a trap, but the princess had somehow managed to stop a firefight with a few words. Either she really was as important as her clothing suggested, or this was the most elaborate ambush in military history. "Rodriguez, what's your read on this?" Marcus called down to his private. Rodriguez was studying the Corvani soldiers, his weapon ready but not aimed at anyone in particular. "Hard to say, Sarge. They look genuinely respectful, not like they're setting up an ambush. And their body language suggests they're actually taking orders from her." Marcus made his decision and began the careful climb back down to the canyon floor. If this was a trap, he was walking into it with his eyes open. If not, he was about to learn something very important about the political dynamics of the Hegemony Alliance. When he reached the bottom, the Corvani commander approached him directly. The alien was massive, even by their species standards, probably 8 feet tall with bronze scales and ceremonial scarring that indicated high military rank. When he spoke, his voice was a deep rumble that the translator rendered as formal, almost apologetic. Human soldier, I am Commander Thexcan of the 7th Assault Legion. Princess Lyralii has informed me of your actions in preserving her life. This service will be remembered by the Corvani people. Marcus was too surprised to respond immediately. He'd been expecting execution or torture, not a formal acknowledgement of service from an enemy commander. Princess Lyralii struggled to sit up, waving off help from the Corvani medic who had appeared at her side. Sergeant Chun, I must ask one more favor of you, she said in standard, her violet eyes meeting his directly. Mom, Marcus replied, defaulting to military courtesy despite the surreal situation. You must come with us to the Hegemony command ship, she said. What happened here tonight? Your choice to save an enemy rather than abandon me. It must be witnessed by the Council of War. They must understand that humans are not the monsters Corvani propaganda has made you appear to be. Marcus felt Rodriguez tense beside him. Going aboard a hegemony ship was tantamount to suicide for human soldiers. Even if the princess meant well, there was no guarantee that her authority would protect them once they were in the heart of enemy territory. But as Marcus looked around the canyon at the Corvani soldiers, all of whom were watching this interaction with obvious interest, he began to understand the larger implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about saving one injured alien. This was about changing the fundamental narrative of the war itself. Princess, Marcus said carefully, I'm honored by your offer, but I have my own chain of command to consider. I can't just disappear with you without reporting to my superiors. Lyralii nodded, as if she'd expected this response. Of course, but perhaps there is a way to serve both our needs. She turned to Commander Thexcan and spoke rapidly in the Corvani language. The commander's response was immediate and decisive. He barked orders to his soldiers, and within minutes they were establishing what looked like a temporary command post in the canyon. Portable communication equipment began appearing from concealed positions, and Marcus realized that this had been a much larger operation than a simple patrol. Sergeant Chun, Princess Lyralii explained, Commander Thexcan has agreed to facilitate a direct communication between you and your command structure. If your superiors approve, you would accompany me as a diplomatic observer to the Council of War. If they refuse, you would be returned to human lines with full honors. Marcus stared at her. You're offering to arrange a prisoner exchange? I am offering to arrange a diplomatic mission, she corrected. There's a difference. What happened tonight? Your willingness to risk your life for an enemy. It represents something that could change the course of this war. But only if the right people witness it. Rodriguez leaned close to Marcus and whispered, Sarge, this could be the intelligence coup of the century. Access to hegemony command structure, their decision-making process, maybe even their strategic planning. Marcus knew his private was right, but he also knew the risks. If this went wrong, it wouldn't just cost them their lives. It could be used as propaganda against humanity, portrayed as proof that humans were treacherous and untrustworthy. But as he looked at Princess Lyralii, seeing the hope in her violet eyes and the obvious sincerity in her expression, Marcus found himself remembering why he'd joined the military in the first place. Sometimes protecting others meant taking calculated risks. And sometimes those risks were worth taking, even when the odds were against you. Princess, Marcus said finally, I'll need to speak with my commanding officer before I can give you an answer. She smiled for the first time since he'd found her in the wreckage, and the expression transformed her delicate features completely. Of course, Sergeant Chun, but I hope you will consider that some opportunities for peace come only once in a generation. As the Corvani soldiers finished setting up their communication equipment, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of 2 entire species. The choice he was about to make would echo through history, one way or another. The twin moons of Cathera continued their silent journey across the alien sky, bearing witness to a moment that would change everything. The communication with Human Command took 3 hours to establish, another hour of heated discussion, and what Marcus suspected was a lot of political maneuvering behind the scenes. He sat in the makeshift Corvani command post, still armed and technically free to leave, while Princess Lyralii received medical treatment from a Zephyrian medical team that had arrived via transport. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the alien communication array, filtered through multiple translation protocols and encrypted channels. Chun, I want you to understand something clearly. What you're proposing goes against every regulation in the book. You're talking about voluntarily entering enemy territory with no backup, no extraction plan, and no guarantee of safe return. Understood, sir, Marcus replied, very aware that his conversation was being monitored by both Corvani intelligence and Princess Lyralii herself. But the potential intelligence value of this opportunity is balanced against the potential propaganda value to the enemy if this goes wrong. Morrison interrupted. If they capture, torture, or execute you, it becomes a recruiting tool for every anti-human faction in the hegemony. And if they somehow turn you, the damage to our operational security could be catastrophic. Marcus glanced at Princess Lyralii, who was resting nearby while a Zephyrian medic worked on her injuries with what looked like living light. She wasn't actively listening to his conversation, but he had no doubt she understood the stakes involved. Sir, what if I could provide real-time intelligence updates? Marcus proposed. The princess has given me a communication device that interfaces with their bioneural networks. I could potentially send tactical information back to our forces throughout the mission. There was a long pause on the other end of the connection. Marcus could almost hear the wheels turning in his captain's head, weighing the military advantages against the enormous risks. Chun, Morrison said finally, I'm going to patch you through to someone with more authority than I have. This decision is way above my pay grade. The connection shifted, and Marcus found himself speaking directly with General Patricia Hayes, commander of the 3rd Fleet's ground operations. Her reputation preceded her, a no-nonsense strategist who had earned her rank through tactical brilliance and an absolute refusal to waste soldiers' lives on pointless operations. Sergeant Chun, the general's voice was crisp and professional. I've been briefed on your situation. Before I make any decisions, I want you to give me your honest assessment of this alien princess. Is she legitimate? And can she be trusted? Marcus considered the question carefully. Ma'am, everything about her suggests high-level authority within the Zephyrian hierarchy. The way the Corvani soldiers responded to her, the quality of her equipment, and her access to command-level communication systems all indicate she's exactly who she claims to be. As for trust, he paused, looking at Lyralii again. She had opportunities to signal the Corvani during our escape, and she didn't take them. When she regained consciousness, her first action was to stop them from firing on us. That suggests her intentions toward humans might be genuine. Might be, the general repeated. Sergeant, I need you to understand something. Intelligence intercepts suggest the hegemony is fracturing from within. There are reports of disputes between the Corvani military leadership and some of the member species about the conduct of this war. The Zephyrians in particular have been pushing for diplomatic solutions. Marcus felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. You think this princess might be part of a peace faction? I think this princess might represent our first real opportunity to drive a wedge between the hardline Corvani and the more moderate hegemony species, General Hayes replied. But that makes this operation both more valuable and more dangerous. If you're successful in opening diplomatic channels, it could shorten this war by years. If you're captured and used as a propaganda tool, it could unite the hegemony against us more strongly than ever. The weight of that responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a physical force. He was being asked to potentially shape the outcome of an interstellar war based on his judgment of an alien princess he'd known for less than 6 hours. General, Marcus said slowly, what are your orders? My orders are that this is your choice, Sergeant. You've earned the right to make this decision for yourself. But if you go with the understanding that you're not just representing yourself or even your unit. You're representing all of humanity to a group of aliens who have been told that we're monsters. The pressure on you to perform perfectly will be enormous. Marcus closed his eyes, thinking of his daughter Sarah back on Earth, of Rodriguez beside him, of all the human soldiers who had died in this war so far. Then he thought of the Zephyrian bodies he'd seen at the crash site, and the look in Princess Lyraliai's eyes when she'd said this war didn't have to continue. General Hayes, Marcus said, opening his eyes and looking directly at the princess, I volunteer for this mission. The connection was quiet for a long moment. Then General Hayes spoke again, her voice carrying a tone Marcus had never heard from a superior officer before. It was almost like pride, mixed with deep concern. Sergeant Shun, you are hereby authorized to accompany Princess Lyraliai to the Hegemony Council of War as an official diplomatic observer. Your mission parameters are simple: observe, report, and survive. Under no circumstances are you to provide any information about human military capabilities, force dispositions, or strategic planning. Is that understood? Understood, ma'am. Good. And Chun, come home safe. That's not a request. That's an order. The connection ended, leaving Marcus alone with the most important decision of his life, now officially made. Rodriguez approached him as he stood up from the communication station. So we're really doing this, Sarge? The private asked. Marcus shook his head. Not we. Me. You're going back to human lines with a full report on everything that's happened here. If this goes wrong, someone needs to be able to tell the real story. Rodriguez looked ready to argue, but Marcus cut him off. That's not a discussion, Private. It's an order. Princess Lyraliai had finished with her medical treatment and was approaching them, moving more easily now that her injuries had been properly treated with Zephyrian biomedical technology. The transformation was remarkable. What had been life-threatening wounds just hours earlier were now sealed and healing visibly. Sergeant Shun, she said, I heard part of your conversation with your leaders. You have decided to accept my invitation? I have, Marcus confirmed. Though I should warn you that my government has specific limitations on what information I can share with your people. Of course, she replied, seeming unsurprised. Diplomatic protocols exist for good reasons. But I believe that simply witnessing your character will be more valuable than any information you might provide. Commander Thexcan approached their group, his massive frame casting shadows in the portable lighting the Corvan he had established. Princess, the transport is ready for departure. The Council of War has been notified of our arrival schedule. Marcus felt a final flutter of anxiety. Once he boarded that transport, he would be completely at the mercy of alien technology and alien intentions. There would be no backup, no extraction plan, and no guarantee that he would ever see Earth again. Princess Lyraliai seemed to sense his momentary hesitation. Sergeant Shun, I want you to understand something. What you did tonight, choosing to save an enemy's life at great risk to your own, it represents something that many in the hegemony believe humans are incapable of. You have already proven them wrong. Everything that happens from this point forward builds on that foundation. Marcus nodded, then turned to Rodriguez. Private, when you report back to command, make sure they understand that this mission was voluntary. Whatever happens to me up there, it was my choice. Rodriguez saluted crisply. Understood, Sergeant. But for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. The hegemony transport was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Where human military vehicles were angular and utilitarian, this craft seemed to have been grown rather than manufactured. Its hull was smooth and organic-looking, with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed rhythmically along its surface. The interior was even more alien, with control surfaces that responded to touch and thought rather than mechanical manipulation. As they lifted off from the surface of Cathera, Marcus got his first clear view of the hegemony fleet in orbit. The ships were massive, each one dwarfing the largest human vessels he'd ever seen. But what struck him most was their diversity. Where human fleets were standardized and uniform, The hegemony ships represented at least a dozen different design philosophies and technologies. It was a visible reminder that he was dealing with an alliance of multiple species, each with their own capabilities and interests. Princess Lyralii joined him at the observation port as they approached the command ship. "Impressive, isn't it?" she said. "The eternal convergence represents the combined technological achievements of 12 different civilizations. It is both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness." "How so?" Marcus asked, studying the massive vessel they were approaching. "Strength because no single species could have built something so advanced," she explained. "Weakness because maintaining cooperation between 12 different cultures, each with their own priorities and prejudices, requires constant diplomatic effort. When that effort breaks down," she gestured toward the smaller human ships engaged in combat exercises in the distance. "Wars like this one become inevitable." The docking process was surprisingly gentle. Marcus had expected the harsh mechanical coupling he was used to from human spacecraft, but the hegemony ship seemed to embrace their transport like a living organism accepting a smaller part of itself. As they disembarked, Marcus got his first look at the interior of Hegemony command vessel. The corridors were vast and multi-leveled, with different sections clearly designed for different species. Corvani personnel moved through areas with high ceilings and reinforced floors, while more delicate species like the Zephyrians occupied zones with softer lighting and what appeared to be more sophisticated life support systems. But what struck Marcus most was the obvious tension between different groups. Corvani soldiers watched Zephyrian diplomats with barely concealed suspicion, while other species seemed to cluster in their own defensive groupings. The alliance that human intelligence had described as monolithically united was clearly showing cracks. Princess Lyralii led him through the ship toward what she described as the council chamber, where the leadership of the hegemony's war effort made their strategic decisions. Along the way, they passed through areas that gave Marcus invaluable insight into alien military capabilities, logistical systems, and command structures. "Princess," Marcus said as they walked, "can you help me understand something? You said the Council of War needs to see human character demonstrated. But why would they believe anything I do? They could assume I'm just an actor playing a role." She considered this carefully before responding. "Sergeant Chun, do you know what binaural resonance is?" Marcus shook his head. "It is a Zephyrian ability to sense emotional and psychological states through binaural interface. We cannot read thoughts directly, but we can detect deception, fear, aggression, and other basic emotional responses. It is part of what makes us effective diplomats. We can tell when someone is lying or when they genuinely want peace." Marcus felt a chill. "So you'll know if I'm not being genuine?" "We will know," she confirmed. "But more importantly, the Council will know. When you demonstrate human compassion or courage, they will be able to sense that it is real rather than performed. That is what makes this opportunity so valuable and so dangerous. You cannot hide who you really are." They reached the council chamber, and Marcus got his first look at the leadership of the Hegemony Alliance. Representatives from 12 different species sat around a curved amphitheater, each group occupying spaces designed for their specific physiological needs. The diversity was staggering, from the massive, rock-like granite speakers to the ethereal, energy-based void dancers. At the center of the amphitheater sat the War Council itself, 5 individuals who appeared to represent the most militarily significant species in the Alliance. Marcus recognized the Corvani representative immediately, a scarred, ancient-looking reptilian with cybernetic enhancements that marked him as a veteran of multiple conflicts. Princess Lyralii approached the center of the chamber, her bearing transforming from the injured refugee Marcus had first encountered to the confident diplomat she truly was. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the vast space without technological amplification. "Honored counselors," she began in Standard, presumably for Marcus's benefit, "I present Sergeant Marcus Chun of the Human Military Forces. 3 days ago, This individual discovered me injured and near death in the wreckage of Transport 779. Despite being engaged in combat with Corvani forces, despite having every tactical reason to leave me behind, he chose instead to risk his own life to provide medical aid and protection. A murmur went through the assembled representatives, and Marcus could feel dozens of alien eyes studying him with intense interest. He forced himself to stand straight and maintain military bearing, despite feeling completely out of place in this gathering of galactic leadership. The Corvani War Counselor, whom Marcus now realized had to be Supreme Commander Krexvar, the architect of the hegemony's military strategy, rose from his position and approached them. Even by Corvani standards, he was massive, probably 9 feet tall with battle scars covering his bronze scales. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble that seemed to resonate in Marcus's chest. Princess Lyralii, your report of this human's actions has been noted. However, isolated acts of battlefield mercy do not necessarily indicate the character of an entire species. How do we know this individual is representative of human nature rather than an exception to it? It was clearly a challenge, and Marcus understood that his response would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the future relationship between humanity and the hegemony. Princess Lyralii had brought him here to demonstrate human character, and now he was being asked to prove that he wasn't just an anomaly. Marcus stepped forward, feeling the weight of history on his shoulders. Supreme Commander, I understand your skepticism, but I'd like to suggest that the question isn't whether I'm representative of all humans. The question is whether humans are capable of the kind of behavior you witnessed. And if we are capable of it, whether that capability might be worth exploring before this war destroys both our civilizations. The chamber fell silent, and Marcus realized that his words had been translated into multiple alien languages simultaneously. For a moment that felt like eternity, he stood alone at the center of the most powerful military council in the galaxy, waiting to learn whether his gamble had paid off. Supreme Commander Krexvar studied Marcus for a long moment, his reptilian eyes unreadable. Then, to Marcus's surprise, the massive Corvani began to circle him slowly, like a predator evaluating potential prey. Interesting, Krexvar rumbled, his voice carrying clearly throughout the council chamber. The human speaks of capability and potential rather than claiming universal virtue for a species. This suggests either genuine wisdom or carefully crafted deception. Marcus forced himself to remain perfectly still as the Supreme Commander completed his circle. He could feel the attention of every council member focused on him, and he understood that this moment was a test of more than just his words. Supreme Commander, Marcus replied carefully, I've been in combat with your forces for over a year. I've seen Corvani soldiers fight with incredible courage and tactical skill. I've also seen them show mercy to wounded enemies and protection to non-combatants. Would it be fair for me to assume that all Corvani possess these qualities, or would it be more accurate to say that your people are capable of both honor and brutality depending on circumstances and leadership? A ripple of surprised murmurs went through the assembled representatives. Marcus had just turned the Supreme Commander's challenge back on him, and done so in a way that acknowledged Corvani military prowess while making a point about the complexity of species-wide character judgments. Krexvar stopped directly in front of Marcus, his massive head tilting slightly as he studied the human. You show more diplomatic skill than I expected from a ground soldier. Princess Lyralii, what else can you tell us about this human's capabilities? Princess Lyralii stepped forward, and Marcus noticed that her bioneural interface devices were now glowing softly. She was apparently scanning him in real time, providing the council with direct information about his emotional and psychological state. Honored counselors, she began, bioneural resonance confirms that Sergeant Shin speaks without deception. His emotional state shows genuine conviction in his words, concern for the welfare of both species involved in this conflict, and No detectable hostility toward any member of this council despite being surrounded by representatives of enemy forces. One of the other council members, a crystalline being that Marcus didn't recognize, spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. The translation system rendered it as, "Princess, bioneural readings can be affected by training or pharmaceutical enhancement. How do we know this human has not been conditioned to present false emotional signatures?" Marcus felt a moment of panic. He had no idea whether human psychology could be trained to fool Zephyrian bioneural scanning. But the implication was clear. They suspected he might be some kind of sophisticated spy or infiltrator. Princess Lyralii, however, seemed prepared for this question. "Counselor Veltar, the bioneural patterns I am detecting are consistent with genuine emotional responses under stress. More importantly, they match the patterns I observed during our escape from the crash site. Unless this human was conditioned specifically to maintain false emotional signatures while under combat stress, carrying an injured enemy, and facing possible death, the readings indicate authentic character traits. Furthermore," she continued, "the specific decision patterns I observed during our escape demonstrate problem-solving approaches that are distinctly human. When faced with apparently impossible tactical situations, this individual consistently chose solutions that prioritize the welfare of others over his own safety. This pattern matches intelligence reports about human behavior in other contexts." Supreme Commander Krexvar returned to his position at the council table, his expression thoughtful. "Princess Lyralii, your observations are noted. However, I am more interested in understanding the strategic implications of human character than in evaluating this particular individual. Sergeant Shun, I have a question for you." Marcus straightened. "Sir, our intelligence suggests that human forces are significantly outnumbered and outgunned in this conflict. Your technology is inferior, your ships are smaller, and your weapons are less advanced. Yet human resistance has been more effective than our projections indicated. From your perspective as a combat soldier, why do humans continue to fight when logic suggests you should surrender?" It was clearly a tactical question disguised as a philosophical one. Krexvar was trying to understand human motivation in order to develop more effective strategies for defeating them. But Marcus realized that an honest answer might actually serve the cause of peace better than any diplomatic evasion. "Supreme Commander, humans have a concept we call stubborn hope," Marcus began. "We tend to believe that impossible situations aren't really impossible. They're just situations where we haven't found the right solution yet. When you tell us we can't win, our first reaction isn't to surrender. It's to start looking for a way to change the rules of engagement." Marcus paused, seeing interest in several alien faces around the council chamber. "But there's something else. Humans fight most effectively when we're protecting something we care about. Every human soldier in this war has family back on Earth, friends in other units, or communities they've sworn to defend. We don't just fight against the hegemony. We fight for specific people whose faces we can picture. And that," added Marcus, looking directly at Krexvar, "is why this war has become so costly for both sides. You're not just fighting human military forces. You're fighting a species that sees this conflict as an existential threat to everyone and everything we care about. That makes us very dangerous opponents, even with inferior technology." The council chamber fell silent again, and Marcus realized he might have just provided valuable intelligence to the enemy about human psychological warfare. But Princess Lyralii was smiling slightly, and her bioneural devices were glowing more brightly than before. "Counselors," she announced, "the human's bioneural patterns during that response show complete authenticity. He genuinely believes what he just told you, and his emotional resonance suggests deep personal connection to the concept he described." Counselor Veltar, the crystalline being, spoke again. "If human motivation is as the sergeant describes, then military victory over their species may require complete extermination rather than conquest. A people who fight for personal connections will not accept subjugation." Marcus felt a chill at the casual way the alien discussed human extinction, but before he could respond, Another council member spoke up. This one appeared to be from a species Marcus had never encountered, tall, graceful beings with features that seemed to shift and flow like water. Counselor Veltar raises an important point, the flowing alien said. But perhaps we should consider the alternative interpretation. If humans fight most effectively when protecting those they care about, then they might also make peace most readily when they believe such peace will better protect their loved ones. Supreme Commander Krexvar leaned forward with obvious interest. Explain, Consilor Netmi. The human demonstrated willingness to risk his life for an injured enemy when he believed such action served a greater good. Counselor Neth-Miz continued. This suggests that human decision-making can transcend simple us versus them calculations when presented with compelling alternatives. If we could demonstrate that continued war threatens human loved ones more than peace with the hegemony would, their stubborn hope might work in favor of diplomatic solutions. Marcus realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, a hegemony war, council seriously discussing peace negotiations rather than military escalation. Princess Lyralii had been right about the political fractures within the alliance. Counselors, Princess Lyralii interjected. I believe we have an opportunity to test Counselor Neth-Miz's theory. Sergeant Shun, would your people be willing to participate in preliminary diplomatic contact if the hegemony were to propose a limited ceasefire in one system? Marcus felt the weight of the question. He was a sergeant, not a diplomat, and he had no authority to negotiate on behalf of humanity. But he also understood that his answer might determine whether this opportunity for peace would be pursued or abandoned. Princess, Marcus said carefully, I can't speak for my government's official position, but I can tell you that most humans I've served with would welcome a chance to resolve this conflict without further bloodshed, if such resolution could be achieved with honor and security for our people. Define honor and security, Supreme Commander Krexvar demanded. Marcus thought carefully before responding. Assurance that humanity would maintain independence and self-governance. Protection for human colonies and civilian populations. And some kind of framework for preventing future conflicts when our species inevitably encounter disagreements. And, in return, prompted Counselor Neth-Miz. Recognition of hegemony authority in matters that don't directly affect human welfare, possible cooperation on mutual threats, and a willingness to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. Marcus paused, then decided to take a calculated risk. Supreme Commander, you asked why humans continue to fight despite being outgunned. But there's another question worth considering. Why is the hegemony willing to continue a costly war against a species that poses no direct threat to your core territories or interests? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had just suggested that the war itself might not be in the hegemony's best interests, a bold statement to make while standing in the heart of their military command structure. Supreme Commander Krexvar's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, one of the other council members spoke. This one was clearly Corvani, but smaller than Krexvar and wearing different insignia. The human raises a valid strategic question, the second Corvani said. General Thexmore, our casualty reports indicate that human resistance has cost us significantly more resources than originally projected. From a purely military efficiency standpoint, diplomatic resolution might serve hegemony interests better than continued conflict. Marcus realized he was witnessing a debate that had probably been going on within hegemony leadership for months. Princess Lyralii hadn't brought him here just to demonstrate human character. She'd brought him here to provide the peace faction with ammunition for their arguments. Supreme Commander Krexvar stood slowly, his massive frame towering over the council chamber. Counselors, this discussion has provided valuable intelligence about human motivation and strategic thinking. However, the question of whether to pursue diplomatic contact requires consideration of factors beyond this chamber's immediate authority. He turned to Marcus directly. Sergeant Shun, you have performed your role admirably. Your presence here has answered several important questions about human psychology and decision-making. But now I must ask you something that may be difficult to answer. Marcus braced himself. Sir, if the hegemony were to offer a limited ceasefire, as Princess Lyralii suggested, how would your military leadership respond? Not your government's official diplomatic position, but your honest assessment of whether human field commanders would honor such an agreement. It was a test, and Marcus knew it. Krexvar was asking him to evaluate the trustworthiness of his own species from an enemy perspective. But it was also an opportunity to address what might be the biggest obstacle to any peace agreement: mutual trust. Supreme Commander, Marcus replied, human military culture places enormous emphasis on honor and keeping one's word. If human commanders agreed to a ceasefire, they would honor it absolutely, even if it meant accepting tactical disadvantages. But they would also expect the same level of commitment from hegemony forces. And if violations occurred, press Krexvar. Accidental violations would be investigated and addressed. Intentional violations would be seen as evidence that the hegemony couldn't be trusted and would likely result in a permanent end to diplomatic efforts. Marcus paused, then decided to add something crucial. But, Supreme Commander, the same would be true in reverse. If hegemony forces honored a ceasefire agreement absolutely, human commanders would see that as evidence that your people could be trusted partners in peace. Princess Lyralii's binaural devices pulsed brightly, and she nodded slightly. Counselors, the sergeant's emotional resonance confirms his conviction that humans would honor such an agreement if offered. Counselor Neth Miz leaned forward. Supreme Commander, I move that we authorize Princess Lyralii to begin preliminary diplomatic contact with human leadership regarding a limited ceasefire in the Centauri system. If successful, it could provide a framework for broader negotiations. Seconded, said General Thex more immediately. Supreme Commander Krexvar looked around the council chamber, clearly evaluating the political dynamics at play. Finally, he nodded slowly. Very well. Princess Lyralii, you are authorized to make initial diplomatic contact with human leadership. Sergeant Chun will be returned to human lines with full diplomatic immunity to facilitate such contact. He paused, his reptilian gaze fixed on Marcus. But understand this, human. If these preliminary negotiations fail, the war will resume with greater intensity than before. The hope you carry with you is also a great responsibility. Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was no longer just a soldier following orders. He had become an unwitting ambassador carrying the hopes for peace between two civilizations. I understand, Supreme Commander, Marcus replied. I won't let either of our peoples down. As the council session began to conclude, Princess Lyralii approached him quietly. Sergeant Chun, you have done something remarkable today. But the most difficult part of this mission still lies ahead. Convincing your own people to trust their enemies may prove harder than convincing their enemies to trust them. Looking around the council chamber at the diverse alien faces that had been listening to every word, Marcus realized she was probably right. But for the first time since the war began, he also believed that peace might actually be possible. The real test would come when he returned to human space, carrying an offer that could end the war or make it infinitely worse. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the observation deck of a UES Defiance, watching the most extraordinary sight in human history unfold before him. The Centauri system, which had been a battlefield for 8 months, was now home to the largest gathering of ships in galactic history, and for the first time since the war began, none of them were firing at each other. The ceasefire had held for exactly 17 days, 4 hours, and 23 minutes. Marcus knew the precise timing because he'd been counting every second since Princess Lyralii's diplomatic shuttle had transmitted the formal peace proposal to Admiral Chun. No relation, despite the shared surname that had caused considerable confusion during the initial negotiations. Still hard to believe, isn't it? Came a familiar voice from behind him. Marcus turned to see Captain Morrison approaching, the man's expression a mixture of relief and lingering skepticism. The captain had been Marcus's primary contact during the complex negotiations that had followed his return to human space. "Sir," Marcus replied, coming to attention. "At ease, Sergeant. Or should I say, Ambassador Chun." Marcus winced at the title. "I prefer Sergeant, sir. I never asked to be a diplomat." "No," Morrison agreed, joining him at the observation port. "But sometimes the job finds the man rather than the other way around. Your preliminary negotiations bought us the breathing room we needed to establish formal diplomatic channels." Through the transparisteel, Marcus could see the fruits of those negotiations. The human fleet maintained position on one side of the system, while the Hegemony Alliance forces held the opposite side. Between them, in a neutral zone around Centauri Prime, a new type of vessel hung in space, the first joint-species diplomatic station ever constructed. The station itself was a testament to what could be accomplished when 12 different species and humanity worked together instead of against each other. Human structural engineering had been combined with Zephyrian biotechnology, Corvani defensive systems, and contributions from every member species of the hegemony. The result was something that looked more like a work of art than a space station, but Marcus knew it was also one of the most advanced and secure facilities in the galaxy. "Sir," Marcus said, "have there been any updates from the formal negotiations?" Morrison's expression became more serious. "That's actually why I'm here, Sergeant. Ambassador Richardson has requested your presence at today's session. It seems the Hegemony delegation has some specific questions that they believe you're uniquely qualified to address." Marcus felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Ever since his return from the Hegemony command ship, he'd been caught between his role as a soldier and his unexpected position as one of the few humans with direct experience of hegemony leadership dynamics. The transition hadn't been easy. "What kind of questions, sir?" Marcus asked. "The kind that could determine whether this ceasefire becomes a permanent peace treaty or whether we go back to shooting at each other next week," Morrison replied grimly. "The negotiations have hit a major snag over the question of enforcement mechanisms. The hegemony wants to establish joint patrols to monitor compliance with any peace agreement, but some of our people are concerned about giving alien forces access to human military operations." Marcus understood the problem immediately. Trust was still the biggest obstacle to peace, and both sides had legitimate security concerns about any joint operations. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself aboard the diplomatic station for the first time since its completion. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Vast, multi-level spaces that accommodated the different environmental needs of all participating species. He passed through sections with varied gravity, atmospheric composition, and lighting design to make every delegation feel comfortable. The main negotiation chamber was located at the station center, a neutral space where human and alien representatives had been meeting for nearly 2 weeks. As Marcus entered, he was struck by how different the atmosphere was from the Hegemony War Council he'd addressed weeks earlier. Where the War Council had been focused and militaristic, the diplomatic gathering felt more like a university seminar. Representatives from different species sat in mixed groups rather than species-specific clusters, and Marcus could see ongoing conversations between humans and aliens who had been shooting at each other just months before. Ambassador Richardson, a career diplomat with 30 years of experience, approached Marcus as he entered. "Sergeant Chun, thank you for coming. I know this isn't exactly what you signed up for when you enlisted." "No, sir," Marcus replied. "But I'm willing to help however I can." "Good, because we need someone who can speak from direct experience about how this war has affected individual soldiers on both sides." Richardson gestured toward the main conference table, where Princess Lorelei was deep in conversation with several human and alien representatives. She looked different than she had during their first encounter. The injured, desperate refugee had been replaced by a confident diplomat wearing elegant robes that seemed to shift color in the station's artificial lighting. But when she saw Marcus, her expression brightened with genuine warmth. "Sergeant Chun," she called out, approaching them with the graceful movements Marcus remembered. "I'm pleased to see you again. Your presence here has been invaluable to these negotiations. Princess, Marcus replied with a slight bow, a gesture he'd learned was appropriate for Zephyrian diplomacy. I hope the talks are going well. Her expression became more serious. That is what we need to discuss. The formal negotiations have reached a critical point, and there are questions about enforcement mechanisms that require input from someone with your unique perspective. Ambassador Richardson led them to a smaller conference room where the core negotiating teams were assembled. Marcus recognized several faces from his time aboard the Hegemony Command ship, including Supreme Commander Krexvar, who acknowledged him with a slight nod. Sergeant Chun, Richardson began, we've reached agreement on most of the major points of a potential peace treaty. Territorial boundaries, trade relationships, dispute resolution mechanisms. All of these have been worked out to everyone's satisfaction. But there's one remaining issue that's proven more difficult. Princess Lyralii picked up the explanation. Both sides agree that any peace treaty requires enforcement mechanisms to prevent violations and address disputes before they escalate to warfare. However, creating such mechanisms requires a level of trust and cooperation that neither side is sure the other possesses. Supreme Commander Krexvar leaned forward. The question, Sergeant Chun, is whether humans and hegemony forces can work together effectively in joint operations. Your experience as both a human soldier and someone who has operated within hegemony command structures makes your perspective particularly valuable. Marcus understood what they were really asking. The success of any peace treaty would depend on the ability of former enemies to work together as allies in maintaining that peace. But such cooperation would only be possible if both sides believed it could actually function. Sir, Marcus said, addressing his remarks to both the human and alien representatives, I think the question isn't whether we can work together. The question is whether we can learn to trust each other enough to try. Explain, prompted Ambassador Richardson. Marcus thought carefully before responding. During my time aboard the Hegemony Command ship, I saw something that surprised me. The different alien species didn't always agree with each other. In fact, there were significant disagreements about strategy, tactics, and even the goals of the war itself. Several of the hegemony representatives shifted uncomfortably, and Marcus realized he was describing internal dynamics they might not want humans to know about. But here's what was interesting, Marcus continued. Despite those disagreements, they found ways to work together when it mattered. Not because they always trusted each other, but because they had established procedures for resolving disputes and mechanisms for ensuring compliance with agreed-upon decisions. Princess Lyralii nodded thoughtfully. You are suggesting that successful cooperation does not require complete trust, but rather effective systems for managing the inevitable occasions when trust breaks down? Exactly, Marcus replied. Humans and hegemony forces don't need to become best friends overnight. We just need to develop systems that work even when we're suspicious of each other. Supreme Commander Krexvar studied Marcus intently. What kind of systems do you envision, Sergeant? Marcus had been thinking about this question ever since the ceasefire began. Joint patrols with mixed crews, but also independent observers from neutral parties. Shared communication protocols with built-in verification systems. Regular exchanges of personnel for training and familiarization. And, most importantly, graduated responses to violations that distinguish between accidents, misunderstandings, and deliberate attacks. You are describing a framework for learning to work together rather than assuming we already can, observed one of the other alien representatives. Yes, sir, Marcus confirmed. Because the truth is, both sides are going to make mistakes during any transition from warfare to cooperation. The question is whether we have systems in place to prevent those mistakes from restarting the war. Ambassador Richardson was taking notes rapidly. Sergeant, these are exactly the kinds of practical considerations we need to address. Can you give us a specific example of how such a system might work? Marcus thought about his experience with Rodriguez during their escape from Kethera. Let's say a joint patrol encounters a suspicious vessel in neutral space. Under current circumstances, both human and hegemony forces might assume hostile intent and open fire. But with proper protocols, they would follow a specific sequence: challenge the vessel, request identification, attempt to board for inspection, and only use force as a last resort. More importantly, every step would be monitored by both human and alien commanders, so any deviation from protocol would be